She was 14 years old. He was the most famous man in America, and in a rented house in Germany, on a night that neither of them expected to matter, they would find something that would take 8 years to become a marriage and a lifetime to understand. But that's not where this story begins. It begins with a man who had everything the world could offer, and nothing that actually mattered. It begins with grief, so heavy it had followed him across an ocean. It begins in a room full of people, where the loneliest person was the one everyone had come to see. The house at Goethestrasse 14 in Bad Nauheim, Germany, was not what anyone would have expected for the most famous entertainer in America. It was a modest 3-story building, with white stucco walls and dark shutters, rented from a local family who had been stunned to learn that Elvis Presley, the Elvis Presley, wanted to live there while he completed his military service. The rent was paid promptly each month. The neighbors had grown accustomed to the occasional cluster of teenage girls who gathered on the sidewalk, hoping for a glimpse of the famous tenant. It was September 1959. Elvis had been in Germany for almost a year. He was 24 years old, a private first class in the United States Army, assigned to the 1st Medium Tank Battalion, 32nd Armor Regiment. Every morning he rose before dawn, put on his uniform, and reported for duty like any other soldier. He drove a jeep, he participated in maneuvers, he pulled guard duty in the cold German nights, standing watch while his breath formed clouds in the darkness. The Army had been his choice, or rather his insistence. When he received his draft notice in 1957, there had been talk of putting him in special services, where he could have spent his military time entertaining troops and staying in the spotlight. Elvis had refused. If he was going to serve, he would serve like everyone else. No special treatment, no shortcuts. But the cost of that decision had been higher than anyone anticipated. His mother, Gladys, had died in August 1958, just weeks before he shipped out for Germany. She was 46 years old. The official cause was a heart attack, though those who knew her understood that her heart had been failing for years, weakened by worry, by the stress of watching her son become something so large that she could no longer protect him from it. Elvis had been granted emergency leave to be at her bedside. He had held her hand as she slipped away. He had wept at her funeral with a grief so raw that photographs of that day still had the power to break hearts decades later. And then he had gotten on a ship and sailed to Germany, leaving behind everything he knew, his home, his career, his country, to serve in an army that didn't care about his fame. The loneliness was profound. He had brought people with him, of course. His father, Vernon, had come to Germany and lived in the house on Goethestrasse. His grandmother, Minnie May, was there too. A rotating cast of friends and fellow soldiers visited regularly, filling the rooms with noise and activity that kept the silence at bay. But late at night, when everyone else was asleep, and Elvis lay in his narrow bed staring at the unfamiliar ceiling, the loneliness found him anyway. It crept in through the cracks of his carefully constructed defenses. It whispered to him about his mother, about the career that might be over by the time he returned to America, about the person he had been before all of this, and the person he was becoming now. He was 24 years old. He had been famous for 5 years. He had sold more records than any artist in history. He had appeared on television and in movies and on the covers of more magazines than he could count, and he had never felt more alone. The party that night was like every other party at the house on Goethestrasse. Someone had brought beer. Someone else had brought records. The living room was full of young soldiers and local girls, and the particular energy that gathered whenever Elvis was in a social mood. He moved through the crowd with practiced ease, talking to everyone, making each person feel like they were the only one in the room, a skill he had developed in the years of fame. But his heart wasn't in it tonight. He kept drifting toward the window, looking out at the dark German street, thinking about things he couldn't name, his mother's face, the sound of her voice, the way she used to call him her little prince when he was a boy in Tupelo. Before any of this, before the world discovered him and carried him away to places she could never follow, Curry Grant, an airman Elvis had befriended, appeared at his elbow. "You okay, E?" Elvis shrugged. "Just thinking." "Well, stop thinking and come meet someone. There's a girl here. She's been asking about you." "They're all asking about me, Curry. That's the problem. This one's different. Curry hesitated, choosing his words carefully. She's young, real young. But there's something about her. I don't know how to explain it. Elvis turned from the window. He wasn't particularly interested. He had met thousands of girls in the past 5 years, and they had all blurred together into a sea of screaming faces and reaching hands and desperate declarations of love from people who didn't know him at all. But something in Curry's expression made him curious. Where is she? She was standing in the doorway, between the living room and the hall. Later, Elvis would try to describe what he saw in that moment, and he would fail. The words always came out wrong, too simple or too complicated, never quite capturing the quality of that first glimpse. She was young, yes, obviously young, in a way that should have made him look away immediately. She was wearing a blue and white sailor dress, the kind of outfit that emphasized her youth rather than disguising it. Her hair was dark brown, almost black, styled in the elaborate way that teenage girls favored in 1959. But her eyes were what stopped him. They were watching him with an expression he didn't recognize. Not the usual starstruck worship he had grown so tired of seeing. Not the calculated flirtation of girls who had practiced their smiles in mirrors before arriving. There was something else in those eyes. A self-possession. A quiet confidence that seemed impossible in someone so young. She was looking at him like she could see through the famous exterior to the person underneath. Like she wasn't particularly impressed by Elvis Presley the legend, but might be interested in Elvis Presley the man, if such a person still existed. He walked toward her. The noise of the party faded as he approached. The other people in the room seemed to recede, becoming background, becoming irrelevant. There was only this girl in the doorway, watching him come closer with an expression that didn't change. "I'm Elvis," he said. It was a stupid thing to say. Everyone in the world knew who he was, but somehow, in that moment, it felt necessary to introduce himself, as if they were meeting for the first time as ordinary people, without the weight of fame. "I know," she said. Her voice was steady, unimpressed. "I'm Priscilla." Priscilla. He tried the name out, feeling how it moved through his mouth. "That's pretty. Thank you." She didn't elaborate. She didn't giggle or blush or do any of the things that girls usually did when Elvis Presley complimented them. She just stood there, looking at him with those remarkable eyes, waiting to see what he would do next. "How old are you?" he asked. 14. The number hit him like cold water. 14. She was 14 years old, a child. The child standing in his house, at his party, looking at him with eyes that seemed to belong to someone much older. He should have walked away. He knew that. Everything in his upbringing, everything his mother had taught him about right and wrong, told him to nod politely and return to the party and never think about this girl again. But he didn't walk away, because when he looked at her, really looked at her, he didn't see a child. He saw someone who understood loneliness, someone who knew what it felt like to be out of place, to carry burdens that others couldn't see, to wear a mask because the world demanded it. He saw himself. "Would you like to sit down?" he asked. "Talk for a while?" She considered the question with a seriousness that seemed beyond her years. "Yes," she said finally, "I would." They sat in a corner of the living room, away from the noise of the party, and they talked. Not about fame, not about music, not about any of the things that people usually wanted to discuss with Elvis Presley. They talked about Germany, about how strange it felt to be so far from home. They talked about her stepfather, Captain Paul Boulou, who was stationed at a nearby Air Force base. They talked about the schools she had attended, the places she had lived, the feeling of never quite belonging anywhere because her family moved so often. And they talked about his mother. Elvis didn't know why he told her. He hadn't talked about Gladys with anyone. Not really. Not in the way he talked about her that night. The grief was still too raw, too enormous, too close to the surface. He had learned to keep it contained, to acknowledge it briefly when asked, and then change the subject before the tears could come. But with Priscilla, the words just came. He told her about Tupelo, about the shotgun shack where he was born, about the poverty that had defined his early years. He told her about his mother's fierce love, her absolute conviction that he was destined for something special. He told her about the twin brother who had died at birth, Jesse Guerin, the shadow sibling, whose absence had shaped everything that followed. And he told her about the end. The hospital room. The moment when he realized she was gone, and he was alone in a way he had never been before. Priscilla listened. She didn't offer platitudes or empty comfort. She didn't try to relate his grief to her own experiences or make the conversation about herself. She simply listened, her dark eyes fixed on his face, her presence a kind of anchor in the storm of emotion that he had been avoiding for over a year. When he finally stopped talking, the party had grown quiet around them. People were leaving, drifting out into the German night. The record player had stopped. The living room was nearly empty. "I'm sorry about your mother," Priscilla said quietly. "She sounds like she was wonderful." She was. Elvis's voice was rough with emotion. "She was everything." "Do you think?" Priscilla hesitated, then continued. "Do you think she would have liked me?" It was an odd question. They had only just met. There was no reason to wonder whether his deceased mother would have approved of a 14-year-old girl at a party. But Elvis understood what she was really asking. "Would I matter to you? Would I be someone worth knowing? Or am I just another face in the endless crowd?" "Yeah," he said slowly. "I think she would have liked you. She would have said you had old eyes. That was something she used to say about people who had been through things. 'That one's got old eyes,' she'd say. 'They've seen more than they should have by now.'" Priscilla's expression flickered, just for a moment. Just long enough for Elvis to see that he had touched something true. "My eyes aren't that old," she said. "Old enough." They sat in silence for a moment. The house creaked around them, settling into the quiet of late night. "I should go," Priscilla said. "My stepfather will be worried." "Yeah." Elvis stood up. "Let me walk you out." They walked to the front door together. The hallway was dim, lit only by a single lamp that someone had left burning. Their footsteps echoed on the wooden floor. At the door, Priscilla turned to face him. "Thank you," she said, "for talking to me, for not treating me like a child." Elvis looked at her. 14 years old, a sailor dress, dark hair and dark eyes, and a self-possession that he had rarely seen in anyone, let alone someone so young. He knew this was the end. They would shake hands, say goodnight, and she would walk out of his life forever. But he didn't want it to be the end. "Can I see you again?" he asked. The question surprised him almost as much as it surprised her. He hadn't planned to ask it. It had just happened. This conversation, this connection, this feeling that he had met someone who actually saw him. Priscilla was quiet for a long moment. "I'm 14, she said. "I know. People would talk. People always talk. My stepfather. We'll figure it out." She studied his face, searching for something. Whatever she found must have satisfied her. "Okay," she said finally. "You can see me again." He smiled. Not the stage smile. Not the magazine cover smile. A real smile, the kind that reached his eyes. She left. Elvis stood in the doorway and watched her walk down the path to the car where her chaperone was waiting. She didn't look back. The car pulled away, its tail lights disappearing into the German night. He stood there for a long time after she was gone. Something had happened tonight, something he couldn't name or explain. A door had opened in his heart that he hadn't known was there. "I think I met someone. Mama," he whispered to the empty hallway. "I don't know what it means yet, but I think I met someone." The weeks that followed were complicated. Captain Paul Beaulieu was not pleased when he learned that Elvis Presley wanted to see his 14-year-old stepdaughter again. He was a military man, career Air Force, with clear ideas about propriety. The age difference alone was cause for concern. The fame made it worse. But Priscilla fought for the right to see him. She argued with a persistence that surprised her parents. She promised to follow any rules they set. She agreed to chaperones, to curfews, to constant supervision. She presented her case with logical clarity that seemed impossible for a 14-year-old girl. Eventually, reluctantly, they agreed. The first official date was at the house on Goethestrasse, with her father present. Elvis was polite, respectful, almost formal. He asked about her school. He discussed music with her father. He played piano and sang gospel songs. Not the controversial rock and roll, but the sacred music his mother had loved. Captain Bayliu was not entirely convinced, but he was not entirely opposed either. The dates continued, always chaperoned, always proper. They went to movies on the base. They had dinner at the house with family present. They talked for hours about everything and nothing, building the kind of intimate knowledge that comes from genuine interest. Elvis told her about his career, the fears that it would be over by the time he returned to America, the uncertainty about whether the public would still want him. He opened up in ways that he hadn't with anyone since his mother died. And Priscilla told him about her life, about moving constantly as a military child, never staying anywhere long enough to form deep friendships, about the loneliness of her particular circumstances, beautiful enough to attract attention, young enough to be dismissed, smart enough to see through superficiality. They understood each other in ways that seemed impossible. He was the most famous man in the world. She was a teenage girl from a military family. Their lives could not have been more different. But beneath the surface, in the places where it actually mattered, they were remarkably alike, both lonely, both isolated by circumstances beyond their control, both searching for someone who could see them as they really were. The night before Elvis left Germany, they sat together in the living room on Goethestrasse. The house was quiet. The packing had been done. In the morning, he would board a plane and fly back to America, back to the career that had been on hold for 2 years, back to a life that seemed impossibly distant from this small German town. Priscilla was trying not to cry. She was 15 now. Her birthday had passed during their months together, but she was still young, still learning how to manage emotions that felt too big for her body. The thought of Elvis leaving, of the ocean that would separate them, was overwhelming. Elvis held her hand. "I'll come back for you," he said. "How do you know?" "Because I know." His voice was certain. "This isn't ending, Priscilla. This is just interrupted. But your career, the movies and the music, none of that matters." He turned to look at her. "My mama used to say that life gives you what you need, not what you want. I spent years wanting fame. I wanted the music and the movies and all of it. And I got it. I got everything I wanted. But it wasn't what I needed." He paused. "I think maybe you're what I need." Priscilla's eyes filled with tears. She didn't trust herself to speak. "I'm not saying it's going to be easy," Elvis continued. "There's going to be people who don't understand. There's going to be pressure and distance. But I'm telling you right now, I'm not going to forget you. When the time is right, I'm going to bring you to America, and we're going to figure this out together. Promise? Promise." He kissed her gently, a promise made physical. In the morning, he was gone. The plane lifted off from Rhine-Main Air Base, carrying Elvis Presley back to America, back to fame. The newspapers covered his departure extensively. Photographers captured him waving from the aircraft steps. No one wrote about the girl he left behind. No one knew that in a house on Goethestrasse, a 15-year-old girl was sitting alone in a living room, holding a photograph, crying quietly, waiting for a promise to be kept. The years between 1960 and 1963 were a test of that promise. Elvis returned to America and immediately reclaimed his position at the top of the entertainment world. The fears that his career would suffer proved unfounded. His time in the army had enhanced his image. The movies came. The hit records came. The screaming fans came. Everything demanded his time and attention and energy, leaving little room for anything else. But he didn't forget Priscilla. He called her. He wrote letters. He sent gifts. Across the ocean, through the months of separation, he maintained the connection. The letters were sometimes brief and sometimes long, sometimes cheerful and sometimes melancholy, but they were constant. For Priscilla, those letters were a lifeline. She was back in Germany, finishing school, living the ordinary life of a military dependent while carrying the extraordinary secret of her connection to the most famous man in America. She couldn't tell anyone about the letters. She carried the relationship in silence. In 1962, Elvis fulfilled that promise. He arranged for Priscilla to visit him in Los Angeles. It required elaborate negotiations with her parents, who remained skeptical. It required guarantees about chaperoning and propriety. The visit was successful, so successful that by 1963, Elvis had convinced Priscilla's parents to allow her to move to Memphis and finish her senior year of high school there. She would live with his father Vernon, properly supervised. She moved to Memphis. Graceland became her world. She learned its rhythms, the late nights and late mornings, the constant presence of the entourage, the particular demands of living with someone whose fame made ordinary life impossible. She transformed herself under Elvis's guidance that sometimes crossed into control. She changed her appearance, her style, her very identity. The natural-looking teenager from Germany became the heavily made-up, dramatically styled woman who would appear beside Elvis in photographs forever. She stayed because she loved him. She stayed because he had seen her when she was 14 years old and treated her like someone who mattered. She stayed because a promise had been made in Germany, and it had been kept. On May 4, 1967, Elvis Presley and Priscilla were married in Las Vegas. The ceremony was small, just a handful of guests in a suite at the Aladdin Hotel. A brief exchange of vows, a kiss captured by photographers and transmitted around the world. The bride wore a dress she had designed herself. The groom wore a black brocade tuxedo. She was 21 years old. He was 32. 8 years had passed since they met in a doorway at a party in Germany. The marriage would not last forever. They would have a daughter, Lisa Marie, born exactly 9 months after the wedding, and they would share 6 years of married life before the relationship collapsed. The divorce in 1973 would be amicable by celebrity standards but devastating nonetheless. But that ending was not visible on the day of the wedding. On that day, there was only the beginning. Two people who had found each other in a rented house in a foreign country, who had recognized something in each other that the rest of the world couldn't see. The girl in the doorway had become the bride. The lonely soldier had become the husband, and the promise that had been made in Germany had finally been kept. Years later, after Elvis was gone, after the divorce and the death and the decades that followed, Priscilla would speak about that first meeting. She would describe the party, the sailor dress, the moment when she looked up and saw him walking toward her. But what she remembered most was not the fame. What she remembered was the loneliness. His loneliness, her loneliness, the recognition that passed between them in that first moment, the understanding that they were, despite everything that should have kept them apart, the same kind of lonely. He saw me, she would say, really saw me, not as a child, not as a fan, as a person, and I saw him. Behind all of it, the fame, the image, everything the world thought they knew, I saw who he really was. She would pause, her face complicated with memories. We were both looking for someone who could see us. And somehow, on that night in Germany, we found each other. That's the story, not the wedding or the divorce, not the fame or the fortune, not the decades of commentary and analysis, just the moment, the meeting, the recognition. Two lonely people who found each other in a living room in Germany and discovered that loneliness, sometimes, is the beginning of love.